A game of power and humiliation takes an unexpected turn when a millionaire woman's plans backfire, igniting a scandal that could destroy her marriage. And if you cherish your family and love videos like this, subscribe to our channel to have 10 years of luck in your life. Madison Carter stood at the marble counter of her Los Angeles mansion's kitchen, watching Jake Thompson with calculated disdain. The chef moved with practiced efficiency, his knife skills evident as he prepared a sample dish for her approval. She noted his well-worn but clean chef's coat, a far cry from the designer outfits that filled her own closet. "I assume you've worked in actual restaurants before?" Madison's voice carried the sharp edge of someone accustomed to making others uncomfortable. She picked up a crystal wine glass, swirling its contents while examining Jake's technique, though perhaps not ones I would frequent. Jake's hands remained steady as he continued his precise cuts. "I've worked everywhere from food trucks to 3-star Michelin restaurants, Mrs. Carter. Each experience taught me something valuable." He didn't look up from his work, maintaining his focus on the delicate plating before him. Madison circled the kitchen island, her Louboutins clicking against the Italian tile. "Food trucks? How quaint." She paused, watching him plate a perfectly seared scallop. "I do hope you've learned proper hygiene since then. My guests are rather particular." Instead of shrinking under her scrutiny, Jake straightened his posture and met her gaze directly. "I assure you, Mrs. Carter, my standards for cleanliness and quality exceed even your expectations. Would you like to examine my health certificates as well? Or shall we focus on the food?" The unexpected challenge in his voice caught Madison off guard. She wasn't used to the help talking back, especially not with such composure. A slight flush colored her cheeks, though she quickly masked it with another sip of wine. Later that evening, Madison's mansion filled with Los Angeles' elite for the inaugural dinner featuring Jake's new menu. She made her way through the crowd, stopping at strategic points to make subtle jabs about her new chef's background. "Yes, he's quite good for someone with his experience level," she told a group of socialites, loud enough for Jake to hear as he emerged from the kitchen. But as the courses began arriving, the conversation shifted. Jake's dishes commanded attention, each plate a masterpiece of technique and creativity. Madison watched with growing irritation as her guests lavished praise on the food, several even requesting to meet the chef personally. "The Wagyu is perfectly prepared," commented Sandra Mitchell, wife of a prominent studio executive. "Where did you find him, Madison?" "He's absolutely brilliant." Madison's smile tightened. "Oh, he came highly recommended by some acquaintances." She watched as Jake emerged from the kitchen again, carrying a tray of immaculately plated desserts. His confidence was evident in every movement, and guests actually applauded when he presented the final course. A dark chocolate souffle with gold leaf and raspberry coulis, Jake announced, his voice carrying across the dining room, paired with a 1982 Chateau d'Yquem, selected to complement the dessert's notes of vanilla and citrus. Madison observed as her guests hung on his every word, their attention completely diverted from her. Even in her own home, at her own dinner party, she found herself becoming a secondary character in Jake's culinary performance. The realization stung, but something else stirred beneath her annoyance, a reluctant admiration for his skill and poise under pressure. As the evening drew to a close, Jake caught her eye across the room. He gave her a slight nod, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. It wasn't submission she saw in his expression, but rather a quiet challenge. In that moment, Madison realized she had underestimated him, and the thought was both unsettling and oddly exciting. The kitchen had become a battleground of sorts, though the weapons were now words rather than insults. Madison found herself spending more time there, ostensibly to discuss menu changes, but the conversations increasingly strayed from food. "The truffles you used last week," Madison said, leaning against the counter one afternoon. "They complemented the dish perfectly." She watched Jake work, noticing how his forearms flexed as he kneaded dough. The kitchen was warm from the ovens, and she had long since discarded her designer jacket. "I sourced them from a small family farm in Italy," Jake replied, not looking up from his work. "They understand quality isn't just about the price tag." The comment could have been a jab at her lifestyle, but his tone held no malice. "And where did you learn about sourcing?" Madison asked, genuinely curious. That's not typically covered in culinary school. Jake paused his work, finally meeting her eyes. Life experience. I spent 6 months in Italy, working for almost nothing, learning from the locals. His hands were covered in flour, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who knew their worth. Not everything valuable comes with a prestigious name attached. The conversation felt dangerous, teetering on the edge of something more personal than employer and employee should discuss. Madison found herself sharing stories about her own travels, surprised by Jake's insightful questions and genuine interest. Later that week, during their regular lunch meeting at Chateau Marmont, Claire watched Madison with growing concern. "You're spending an awful lot of time with the chef," she remarked, stirring her martini with practiced elegance. Madison adjusted her sunglasses, grateful they hid her expression. "We're planning the governor's dinner. Everything needs to be perfect." Perfect? Claire's perfectly manicured eyebrow arched. "Or perfectly dangerous. I've seen how you look at him, Madison. And more importantly, I've seen how he looks at you." "Don't be ridiculous," Madison scoffed, but her voice lacked conviction. "He's an employee. An employee who's gotten under your skin." Claire leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Richard may be busy with his deals, but he's not blind. And neither is anyone else in our circle." Madison felt her chest tighten at the mention of her husband's name. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" Claire's tone was gentle, but firm. "Because the Madison I know wouldn't spend hours in the kitchen discussing menu plans. The Madison I know wouldn't defend a chef to her friends at the club. And she certainly wouldn't blush every time his name is mentioned." The truth of Claire's words hung heavy in the air between them. Madison opened her mouth to protest, but the words died on her lips as her phone buzzed with a message. It was Jake, asking about wine pairings for the weekend's event. That evening, Madison found herself back in the kitchen, long after the staff had gone home. Jake was there, as she knew he would be, preparing for the next day's events. "You didn't have to come back," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "I know." Madison's voice was barely above a whisper. The silence between them crackled with tension. Jake set down his knife, turning to face her fully. "This isn't just about the food anymore, is it?" Madison felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "No," she admitted, more to herself than to him. "I think we both know it's not." "I should leave," Jake said, but he made no move toward the door. Instead, he took a step closer to her. "Find another position. Make this easier for both of us." "Is that what you want?" Madison asked, her heart pounding. Jake's response was quiet but clear. "What I want stopped being simple the moment I met you." The confession hung in the air between them, changing everything and nothing at once. Madison felt the weight of her wedding ring. The expectations of her social circle, and the warnings from Claire all pressing down on her. Yet in that moment, standing in her kitchen with a man who saw through her carefully crafted facade, none of it seemed to matter as much as it should. Richard Carter noticed the changes in his wife gradually, like watching a familiar painting slowly fade. At first, they were subtle shifts. Madison skipping their usual Sunday brunches at the Beverly Hills Hotel, claiming she needed to oversee menu planning. Her phone constantly buzzing with messages she'd quickly dismiss. The way she'd become animated when discussing upcoming events, though he knew she'd long ago grown tired of their social obligations. During a rare dinner together in their formal dining room, Richard observed Madison picking at her food, her mind clearly elsewhere. The distance between them at the long mahogany table seemed to mirror the growing gulf in their marriage. "The new menu seems to be getting rave reviews," Richard commented, cutting into his steak. "Everyone at the club keeps talking about our latest acquisition." Madison's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Jake isn't an acquisition, Richard. He's a professional." "Jake?" Richard's eyebrow raised at the informal address. "I wasn't aware we were on a first-name basis with the staff now." "Times change," Madison replied coolly, though a slight flush colored her neck. "Modern kitchen management requires a more collaborative approach." Later that night, while Madison was in the shower, Richard noticed her phone light up on the bedside table. A message notification caught his eye. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., need to discuss the new direction." It was from Jake, No last name listed in the contact. Richard's jaw tightened. In real estate, he'd built his empire by recognizing patterns, seeing the signs of a property about to change hands. Now, those same instincts were screaming that something was shifting in his own house. He began paying closer attention. Security footage showed Madison spending hours in the kitchen, long after events had ended. Expense reports revealed private tastings that seemed excessive even for their lifestyle. His wife's laughter, once rare in recent years, now floated up from the kitchen regularly. The final confirmation came during a business lunch at the Peninsula. Richard was discussing a new development project with investors when he spotted Jake at the bar, apparently waiting for a meeting. The chef was dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual kitchen whites, and Richard was struck by how young and fit he looked. "Everything all right, Richard?" his business partner asked, noticing his distraction. "Just fine," Richard replied, his knuckles white around his whiskey glass. "I think I've just spotted a potential problem that needs addressing." He approached the bar, sliding onto the stool next to Jake. The younger man tensed slightly, but maintained his composure. "Mr. Carter," Jake acknowledged, his voice neutral. "I wasn't expecting to see you here." "Clearly," Richard replied, signaling the bartender. "I make it a point to know everything that happens in my houses, my properties, and my investments." He turned to face Jake fully. "So tell me, what exactly are your intentions with my kitchen?" The emphasis on the word kitchen hung heavy between them. Jake met Richard's gaze steadily, neither backing down nor showing aggression. "My intention is to maintain the highest standards of culinary excellence for your events, Mr. Carter. Nothing more, nothing less." Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Come now, we're both men of the world. Let's not pretend we don't understand what's really being discussed here." "With all due respect, sir," Jake replied, standing up, "I think you might be confusing professional dedication with something else. If you have concerns about my work, I'm happy to address them formally." As Jake walked away, Richard pulled out his phone and made a call. "James? I need a complete background check on Jake Thompson. Everything: previous employment, financial records, personal history." "Yes, it's urgent." The tension in Richard's shoulders didn't ease as he returned to his business lunch. He'd built his empire through strategic planning and careful elimination of threats. Now, watching his wife's chef disappear through the restaurant's doors, Richard began formulating a plan to protect what was his. The annual real estate development gala transformed the Carter Mansion into a glittering showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over hundreds of Los Angeles' elite, all dressed in their finest. Madison moved through the crowd in a fitted black Valentino gown, playing her role as hostess while secretly watching the kitchen doors. During a quiet moment, she slipped away from the main hall, finding Jake in the less crowded West Wing. He stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, his chef's jacket replaced with a well-fitted suit that surprised her. "You clean up well," Madison said softly, approaching him. The distant sounds of the party faded in a background noise. "I'm full of surprises," Jake replied, turning to face her. His eyes traced her figure appreciatively. "Though tonight, you're the one who's leaving everyone speechless." Madison stepped closer, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. "I've been thinking about what you said last week, about being true to ourselves." Jake reached out, his fingers barely brushing her arm. "And what conclusion did you reach?" "That perhaps it's time to stop pretending." Madison's words were cut short by the sound of rapid footsteps approaching. Richard appeared in the doorway, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. His usual polished demeanor had cracked, revealing something dangerous underneath. In his hand, he clutched a manila envelope. "Don't let me interrupt this touching moment," he said, his voice carrying across the space. Several party guests turned their heads, attracted by the tension in his tone. "I've been wondering where my wife disappeared to. Now I see she's conducting another private tasting." Madison stepped away from Jake, but it was too late. Richard advanced into the room, deliberately drawing attention. More guests began to gather, sensing the drama unfolding. "Richard, this isn't the time or place," Madison started. "Oh, I think this is exactly the time and place." Richard cut her off, his voice rising. "Let's share with our guests how our esteemed chef has been providing special services beyond his culinary expertise." Jake stepped forward, his voice low and controlled. "Mr. Carter, if you have concerns about my professional conduct, we can discuss them privately." "Professional conduct?" Richard laughed harshly, opening the envelope. "Is that what we're calling it? These photos tell a different story." He began pulling out surveillance images, Madison and Jake in what appeared to be intimate conversations, standing too close in the kitchen, meeting at various locations around the city. The crowd had grown larger, phones discreetly emerging to capture the unfolding scandal. Madison felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble as whispers spread through the gathering crowd. "Your reputation was everything to you, wasn't it, Madison?" Richard's voice dripped with venom. "Let's see how it survives this. And you," he turned to Jake, "I'll make sure you never work in this city again. No respectable establishment will touch you after this." Jake moved to stand between Richard and Madison. "That's enough. These people don't deserve to be part of your personal vendetta." "My vendetta?" Richard's voice rose to a shout. "You come into my house, seduce my wife, and dare to talk about vendettas?" The sound of a glass shattering somewhere in the crowd punctuated the silence that followed. Madison looked around at the faces of her social circle, some shocked, others gleeful. Why scandalized, all judging. Claire stood at the edge of the crowd, her expression unreadable. "Everyone out," Madison commanded, finding her voice. "The party's over." But the damage was done. As guests began to file out, their phones were already busy spreading the news. By morning, every social media outlet and gossip column in Los Angeles would be buzzing with the story of Madison Carter's affair with her chef. Jake tried to approach Madison, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," she whispered. "Just don't." She turned and walked away, her heels echoing on the marble floor, leaving both men standing in the wreckage of the evening. Richard's voice followed her retreat. "I hope he was worth it, Madison, because you've just lost everything." The master suite of the Carter mansion had always been Madison's sanctuary, but now its luxurious expanse felt like a gilded cage. She sat at her vanity, mechanically removing diamond earrings worth more than most people's annual salary, watching her mascara-stained reflection in the mirror. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, messages from so-called friends, news alerts, and social media mentions, all dissecting her humiliation in real time. Hours passed as she sat motionless, replaying the evening's events. The carefully curated life she'd built over 15 years had shattered in mere minutes. The silence of the room was broken only by the occasional ping of her phone, each sound making her flinch. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Madison? It's Claire." The door opened slightly, and Claire slipped in, still wearing her gala dress. She carried a bottle of aged scotch and 2 glasses. "If you've come to say I told you so, save your breath," Madison said, her voice hoarse. Claire poured 2 generous measures of scotch. "Actually, I came to tell you that Richard's press team is already spinning the story. They're painting you as an unfaithful wife who fell for the help." She handed Madison a glass. "But that's not the whole truth, is it?" Madison took a long sip, welcoming the burn. "Does it matter? The damage is done. It matters if you want it to matter." Claire settled onto the chaise lounge, studying her friend. "I've known you for 20 years, Madison. I watched you build this perfect life, checking every box society demanded. But when was the last time you were actually happy?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Madison's hand trembled slightly as she set down her glass. "I don't have the luxury of happiness. I have obligations, expectations." "To whom?" Claire interrupted. "To Richard, who's been sleeping with his secretary for the past 3 years. To our social circle, who are probably all gleefully texting about your downfall right now. Or to yourself." Madison's head snapped up. "Richard's been what?" Claire's expression softened. "You didn't know? I assumed you must have known. It's why I never said anything when I noticed your connection with Jake. I thought maybe you were finally allowing yourself something real." The revelation should have hurt more, Madison realized. Instead, she felt an odd sense of relief, followed by anger, not at the infidelity, but at her own blindness to it. 2 days later, Madison sat in a quiet cafe in Venice Beach as far from her Beverly Hills world as she could get while still in Los Angeles. Jake sat across from her, his usual confident demeanor tempered by concern. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said, his fingers wrapped around a coffee cup. "I should have left when I first realized how I felt about you." Madison studied his face, seeing past the surface that had first attracted her. "Why didn't you?" "Because for the first time in my life, I met someone who saw past what I could do for them." Jake leaned forward. "You started out trying to humiliate me, but somewhere along the way, you actually saw me. The real me. And I saw you too. Not the society wife, not the wealthy hostess, but you. And what exactly did you see?" Madison's voice wavered slightly. "A woman who spent so long playing a role she's forgotten who she is beneath it. Someone brilliant and sharp, who uses arrogance as armor because she's afraid to be vulnerable." Jake reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Someone worth losing everything for." Madison didn't pull her hand away. "I'm toxic right now. Richard will make sure of that. Your career, my career?" Jake interrupted with a slight laugh. "Madison, I've worked in food trucks and Michelin-starred restaurants. I've cooked in war zones for relief organizations. I don't need the approval of Beverly Hills socialites to know my worth." The simplicity of his statement struck something deep inside Madison. Worth that wasn't tied to social status or bank accounts. Worth that existed independently of others' approval. "I don't know who I am without all of this," she admitted quietly. Jake squeezed her hand. "Maybe it's time to find out." Richard Carter sat in his Century City office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. 3 PR specialists and his personal lawyer occupied the leather chairs before his desk, while his laptop displayed headlines about the scandal. Real estate mogul's wife in steamy chef affair. Carter marriage crashes amid kitchen romance. "I want her destroyed," Richard stated coldly, sliding a check across his mahogany desk. "Not just socially, completely." The lead PR specialist, Jessica Morton, reviewed the strategy document. "We've already placed stories with key influencers. The narrative paints Madison as an aging socialite desperate for attention, throwing herself at a younger man. We're emphasizing her excessive spending, suggesting possible substance abuse issues." "Not enough," Richard interrupted, standing to pace. "I want every charity board she sits on to remove her, every social club to revoke her membership, every friend to abandon her." He paused, looking out over his city. "Make it clear, crossing me has consequences." Within days, the attacks began. Madison's phone buzzed with notifications of being removed from various boards. Anonymous sources quoted in gossip columns discussed her supposed drinking problems, her erratic behavior at events. Photos emerged of her and Jake, carefully selected to look incriminating, even when they weren't. Claire found Madison in her home office, systematically deleting social media apps from her phone. "They're saying I had an affair with 3 other men before Jake," Madison said without looking up. "Apparently, I also have a cocaine habit and underwent secret rehab last year." "Richard's work," Claire confirmed, settling into a chair. "He's calling in every favor, using every connection. But we can fight back." Madison finally looked up, her expression hardening. "How?" "You're not the only one with powerful friends," Claire replied, pulling out her tablet. "And more importantly, you're not the only one who knows where bodies are buried. Metaphorically speaking, of course." Jake arrived later that afternoon, carrying a stack of papers. "You need to see these," he said, spreading documents across Madison's desk. "Remember when Richard insisted on handling all the charitable donations in your name? Look at where the money actually went." Madison scanned the papers, her eyes widening. "These are shell companies. He's been laundering our charitable donations." "Not just laundering," Jake explained. "He's been inflating the amounts for tax purposes while actually donating a fraction. The rest disappears into offshore accounts." "How did you get these?" Madison asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Claire," Jake confirmed. "She's been gathering evidence for months." Apparently, she never trusted Richard. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Richard stormed into the house that evening, face flushed with anger. "You're trying to audit THE Foundation," he shouted, finding Madison in the library. "You really want to play this game?" Madison stood her ground. "No games, Richard. Just truth. Like the truth about your secretary? Or should we discuss the creative accounting in our charitable giving? You sanctimonious bitch, Richard spat. You think you can threaten me? I built this life for you. Everything you are is because of me. No, Madison's voice was steady. Everything I am is despite you. I've spent 15 years playing the perfect wife, hosting your parties, supporting your image, while you built your empire on lies and manipulation. Careful, Madison. Richard's voice dropped dangerously low. You're not the only one who can make allegations. How would your chef feel about certain incidents from your past? The real reason you left New York? Madison felt her blood run cold. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Richard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I had you investigated long before we married. I know everything, including what happened with David Porter in 2005. One phone call, and your life becomes very complicated. The air crackled with tension as decades of secrets and lies hung between them. Madison realized that this wasn't just about her affair with Jake anymore. It was about power, control, and the carefully constructed facades they'd both maintained for years. The law offices of Goldman and Associates occupied the top floor of a Century City high-rise, far enough from Beverly Hills to avoid immediate gossip. Madison sat across from Patricia Goldman, one of Los Angeles' most formidable divorce attorneys, watching as the lawyer reviewed the documents spread across her desk. The good news, Patricia began, removing her reading glasses, is that California's community property laws work in your favor. The bad news is that Richard's team will fight dirty. These financial discrepancies in the foundation could implicate you as well. Jake, who sat quietly beside Madison, leaned forward, but she wasn't involved in the financial decisions. Doesn't matter, Patricia replied. As a board member and primary fundraiser, she had a fiduciary responsibility. Richard's lawyers will argue she knew or should have known. Madison absorbed this information, her fingers unconsciously twisting the wedding ring she still wore. And what about other allegations? Patricia's eyes narrowed. You mean the New York incident? Yes, Claire briefed me. It's problematic but manageable. The statute of limitations has expired, and without concrete evidence, Richard has evidence, Madison interrupted quietly. He's made that clear. The attorney made a note on her legal pad. Then we need to get ahead of it. The best defense is a strong offense. Are you prepared for everything to come out? Not just Richard's indiscretions, but yours as well? Jake reached for Madison's hand, but she pulled away slightly. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by Patricia. Which brings me to another point, the lawyer continued. Your relationship with Mr. Thompson. While adultery isn't a legal factor in California divorce proceedings, it does affect public opinion. And public opinion can influence settlement negotiations. Later that evening, Madison found herself at Richard's office, responding to his demanded meeting. The city lights twinkled below, a sharp contrast to the tense atmosphere inside. I had an interesting lunch with David Porter today. Richard began without preamble. He sends his regards. Madison's carefully maintained composure slipped slightly. You actually called him? Of course I did. Richard poured himself a scotch, not offering her one. I also have some fascinating documents from that time period. Amazing what money can uncover. He smiled coldly. So, shall we discuss terms? Terms for making this all go away. Richard sat behind his desk. You drop the audit, sign a generous but not excessive divorce settlement, and fade quietly into obscurity. In return, certain historical documents remain buried. Madison felt the walls closing in. The carefully constructed narrative she'd built around her past threatened to unravel. Jake believed in her, saw her as someone worthy of sacrificing everything for. But would he feel the same way if he knew the truth about New York? Her phone buzzed, a message from Jake. Whatever he's threatening, we'll face it together. You're stronger than his manipulation. The words burned into her consciousness, forcing her to confront a fundamental choice. Continue living under Richard's control, protecting her secrets but losing herself, or risk everything, including Jake's love, for the chance at genuine freedom. You know what your problem is, Richard? Madison finally spoke, her voice steady. You think everyone is as afraid of the truth as you are. Richard's smile faltered slightly. Don't be foolish, Madison. Think about what you're risking. Your reputation, your social standing. No, she cut him off. I'm thinking about who I am without those things. And I'm starting to realize that person might be worth knowing. Even if it costs you everything, including your precious chef. Richard's voice dripped with disdain. How understanding do you think he'll be when he learns what really happened in New York? Madison stood, smoothing her skirt. I guess I'll find out. Because here's my counteroffer. I'm not signing anything. I'm not going quietly. And I'm done letting fear of the past control my future. She turned to leave, but Richard's voice stopped her. You're making a terrible mistake. No, Madison replied without turning around. I made my terrible mistakes years ago. First by letting David Porter manipulate me, then by letting you do the same thing. I'm finally making a choice for myself. The Carter mansion glowed against the twilight sky, transformed once again for a party, but this time the atmosphere was different. Madison had personally curated the guest list, excluding the usual social climbers and including individuals known for their independence from Richard's influence. The press had been strategically invited, not the gossip columnists, but respected journalists known for their investigative reporting. In the kitchen, Jake supervised the final preparations, though his role tonight went beyond that of chef. They'd carefully chosen a menu that told their story, dishes that represented pivotal moments in their relationship, each one carrying meaning beyond its culinary appeal. Are you sure about this? Claire asked, finding Madison in her dressing room. She wore a striking red gown, a deliberate departure from her usual conservative choices. I've spent 15 years letting other people write my story, Madison replied, applying her lipstick with steady hands. Tonight, I tell my own version. The party hummed with nervous energy. Guests whispered among themselves, aware they were participating in something unprecedented in their social circle. Richard's allies were conspicuously absent, creating a vacuum that altered the usual power dynamics. At precisely 9 o'clock, Madison took her place at the front of the room. The crowd fell silent, phones discreetly recording what promised to be either a social suicide or a remarkable comeback. Thank you all for coming, Madison began, her voice clear and strong. I'm sure many of you expected this to be an apology tour. It's not. She paused, letting the whispers ripple through the crowd. Instead, this is a story about power, truth, and the price we pay for both. She gestured to the room around them. This house, these parties, the perfect image. They're all part of a carefully constructed facade. For years, I helped maintain that facade, convincing myself that power and prestige were adequate substitutes for authenticity and love. The crowd shifted uncomfortably as Madison continued. But facades crack, and when they do, we have a choice. Patch over the cracks or tear down the whole structure and build something real. Jake emerged from the kitchen, still in his chef's coat, and stood at the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly before Madison continued. Society loves to whisper about affairs, about scandal, about women who dare to step out of the roles assigned to them. But how many of you have asked why? How many have questioned the systems that keep us trapped in gilded cages of our own making? She moved through the room as she spoke, commanding attention not through wealth or status, but through raw authenticity. Yes, I fell in love with my chef, but this isn't a story about an affair. It's about finding the courage to be authentic in a world that profits from our pretense. The room was completely silent now, every guest captivated by this unprecedented display of vulnerability from someone they'd known only as an ice queen. Some of you are here because you face similar choices, others because you're tired of the games we all play, and some, she smiled slightly, because you couldn't resist watching what you assumed would be my social downfall. A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Madison's smile widened. But here's what I've learned. When you stop fearing the fall, you realize you might actually be learning to fly. Jake moved forward through the crowd, joining Madison at the front. The gesture was both a statement and a challenge to the watching audience. So yes, the rumors are true. I fell in love. I broke rules. I shattered expectations. But in doing so, I found something more valuable than social standing or public approval. I found myself. The silence that followed was broken by a single person beginning to applaud. Then another, and another. Soon, the room filled with applause. Not the polite, kind comment at social functions, but genuine, enthusiastic support. As the evening progressed, guests approached Madison not with condemnation, but with their own stories of trapped lives and compromised dreams. The narrative was shifting, transforming from scandal to inspiration. Richard's retaliation came swiftly. Anonymous sources began floating stories about Jake's past. Allegations of theft from previous employers, suggestions of gambling debts, hints of professional misconduct. The stories appeared first in smaller blogs, then gained traction in larger publications, each one carefully crafted to destroy Jake's professional credibility. "He's saying I stole wine from the Rothschild estate in France," Jake said, showing Madison the latest article on his tablet. They sat in Claire's Malibu beach house, their temporary sanctuary from a media storm. "I've never even worked there." Madison scrolled through the allegations, her jaw tightening. "He's getting sloppy, making mistakes." She pointed to a detail in the article. "This claims you were in France in 2018, but you were running a relief kitchen in Haiti then. We have proof." Claire entered with a thick folder. "And that's not all we have." She spread photographs across the coffee table, surveillance images of Richard meeting with various individuals in private locations. "Our investigator has been busy. Recognize anyone?" Madison leaned forward, studying the images. "That's James Chun," she said, pointing to one photo. "He's on the zoning board. And there's Michael Foster from the building department." She looked up at Claire. "Why would Richard be meeting them in parking garages?" "Because," Claire smiled grimly, "bribing public officials is generally frowned upon, especially when it involves redirecting federal disaster relief funds meant for low-income housing." Jake whistled low. "That's why those affordable housing projects never materialized after the wildfires." Madison stood, pacing the room. "We need to be careful. Richard has powerful friends." "Had powerful friends," Claire corrected. "Your speech at the party changed things. People are starting to question their allegiances." The confrontation occurred at the Pacific Design Center during a major real estate development conference. Richard was midway through a presentation about urban renewal when Madison walked in, flanked by Jake and Claire. The audience stirred, phones emerging to capture whatever was about to unfold. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Madison said, her voice carrying across the room, "but I think it's time we discuss the real estate development practices in this city." Richard's face hardened. "Security," he called, but no one moved. "No need for that," Madison continued, moving toward the stage. "I'm sure everyone here would be interested in seeing these documents." She held up a USB drive, particularly the parts about the misappropriation of federal relief funds. "You're making a fool of yourself," Richard hissed, but his face had paled slightly. "Am I?" Madison connected the drive to the presentation system. "Because I have proof of every bribe, every falsified permit, every diverted fund. Would you like to see them?" She turned to the audience. "Would all of you like to see them?" Richard lunged for the computer, but Jake stepped between them. "I wouldn't," he said quietly. "The files are already being sent to the FBI and the Los Angeles Times." "You think anyone will believe you?" Richard snarled, but his composure was cracking. "A cheating wife and her lover boy chef? They'll believe the evidence." Claire stepped forward, addressing the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is documented proof of systematic corruption in Los Angeles real estate development, orchestrated by Richard Carter and his associates." The first documents appeared on the screen: bank transfers, coded emails, surveillance photos. The audience gasped as names and amounts became visible. "This is just the beginning," Madison announced. "Every crooked deal, every bribed official, every stolen dollar, it's all coming out." Richard's face contorted with rage. "You stupid bitch," he spat. "You have no idea what you've done. When I'm finished with you..." "When you're finished..." Claire interrupted, her voice sharp. "Oh, Richard, I've been documenting your corruption for years, waiting for the right moment." Madison's scandal just provided the perfect opportunity. The revelation hit Madison like a physical blow. She turned to her friend, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You knew? All this time?" Claire's smile was both apologetic and triumphant. Someone had to protect you from yourself. And from him. Madison sat in her attorney's office, watching the media frenzy unfold on multiple screens. Headlines flashed across each one. Real estate mogul Richard Carter under federal investigation. Corruption scandal rocks LA development industry. Whistleblower exposes millions in misappropriated funds. The FBI has everything, Patricia Goldman confirmed, closing her laptop. The evidence is overwhelming. Richard's facing multiple federal charges. Madison barely heard her, still processing Claire's revelation. Her oldest friend had been orchestrating this for years, playing a long game none of them had suspected. Every lunch, every worried conversation about Jake, every piece of advice, had it all been calculated? What about the New York situation? Madison asked quietly. Buried, Patricia assured her. Claire made sure those records disappeared long ago. Apparently, she's been cleaning up loose ends for years. The door opened, and Jake entered, looking troubled. You need to see this, he said, handing Madison his phone. On the screen was a video of Richard at an hastily arranged press conference. These allegations are baseless. Richard's recorded image declared, though his usual confidence seemed forced. This is nothing more than revenge from a bitter ex-wife and her lover. In fact, I have evidence that Madison Carter has been involved in her own illegal activities. The feed cut off abruptly as Claire walked into the frame, approaching the podium. The assembled reporters stirred with interest. Claire Anderson, socialite and philanthropist, about to speak. Claire, Madison whispered, watching the scene unfold. What are you doing? On screen, Claire faced the cameras with practiced ease. Good afternoon. I'm here to set the record straight about a few things. She paused, making eye contact with specific reporters. For the past 5 years, I've been working with federal investigators to document corruption in Los Angeles real estate development. The reporters erupted with questions. Richard tried to leave the podium, but security blocked his exit. Everything you're about to learn has been verified and documented, Claire continued. The abuse of federal relief funds, the bribing of officials, the offshore accounts, it's all true. And I can prove it. Madison watched in stunned silence as Claire methodically dismantled Richard's empire, revealing how she had positioned herself as the perfect confidant, the trusted friend to both Madison and Richard, all while gathering evidence. But why? Jake asked, watching Madison's face. Why go to all this trouble? The answer came moments later, as Claire delivered her final blow. Madison Carter wasn't just Richard's wife, she announced. She was my friend, and I watched for years as Richard manipulated and controlled her, just as he manipulated this city's development for his own profit. When she finally found the courage to break free, he tried to destroy her. But he forgot one important thing. Some of us play the long game. Richard lunged at Claire, his composure finally shattering completely. You scheming witch, you were behind all of this. Security intervened as Claire smiled calmly. No, Richard, you were behind all of this. I just made sure everyone would know the truth. Back in the attorney's office, Madison's phone buzzed with a message from Claire. Meet me at our spot. It's time you knew everything. An hour later, Madison found Claire at their regular table at Chateau Marmont. The woman who had orchestrated the downfall of Richard Carter looked remarkably serene. You used me, Madison said, sitting down. You used my relationship with Jake, my scandal, everything. No, I protected you. I knew what Richard was long before you married him. I knew what happened in New York wasn't your fault. And I knew someday you'd need an escape route. So I built one, piece by piece, year by year. Why? Madison whispered. Claire's composed facade cracked slightly. Because 20 years ago, I was you. Different city, different man, same story. Nobody helped me then. I swore I'd never let it happen to someone else I loved. The truth settled over them like a soft blanket. Every lunch, every shopping trip, every society event. Claire had been weaving a safety net Madison never knew she needed. Jake arrived as they finished talking, taking the seat beside Madison. So, he said, looking at Claire, was I part of your plan too? Claire smiled, genuinely this time. No, you were the wild card. The one variable I couldn't control. And you turned out to be exactly what Madison needed. Not to escape Richard, but to find herself. Madison reached for Jake's hand, then Claire's, forming a triangle of trust at the table. So, what happens now? Now, Claire raised her glass. Now you live your life. Your real life. And I go back to what I do best. Watching, waiting, and making sure the Richard Carters of the world don't win. The three of them sat there, in the fading Los Angeles sunlight, as the city buzzed with the biggest scandal it had seen in years. But for Madison, the real story wasn't about Richard's crimes or Claire's long game. It was about finding truth in unexpected places and the different forms love can take: romantic, friendly, and most importantly, self-love. To new beginnings, Claire toasted. To truth, Jake added. To freedom, Madison finished, finally understanding the full weight of F the word.